Tommy had been working as a janitor on Station Kepler 7 for almost 3 years now. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and kept him out of trouble back home on Earth. He pushed his cleaning cart down the long metal corridors every single day, moving in the same rhythm he'd perfected over countless shifts. The hum of the station's engines had become like a heartbeat to him, so familiar he barely noticed it anymore. The cafeteria was his last stop of the evening shift. Tommy liked working nights because fewer people were around. He could move at his own pace, think his own thoughts, and not worry about getting in anyone's way. The place was empty now, just the soft glow of emergency lighting casting long shadows across the tables and floor. He grabbed his mop and started working through the aisles, picking up napkins, wiping down tables where people had left crumbs and spilled drinks. That's when he heard it, a small sound almost like a whimper. Tommy looked up and saw something that made him freeze. Near the food disposal unit in the back corner, barely visible in the darkness, was a small figure. At first Tommy thought it was another worker, maybe someone new he hadn't met yet. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized what he was looking at. It was a kid. An alien kid. The creature was maybe 4 feet tall, with thin, fragile-looking limbs that seemed almost translucent. Its skin had a bluish-gray color with patterns of darker markings running down its sides. 2 antenna-like appendages grew from the top of its head, and they were trembling slightly. But what really got to Tommy was the look in the kid's eyes. They were so hollow, so empty, like someone had drained all the hope out of them. Tommy recognized the species immediately. Zarthon. He'd seen them before on the station, always moving in groups, always talking in harsh, aggressive tones. The Zarthon Empire wasn't exactly known for being friendly. They were one of the reasons the station kept security so tight. But this kid looked nothing like the intimidating soldiers he'd seen around. This kid looked scared and hungry. The little one seemed to notice Tommy at the same moment. Its whole body went rigid, and the antennae pulled back flat against its head in what Tommy somehow knew was a defensive gesture. The kid started backing away slowly, staying close to the wall like it was trying to become invisible. "Hey, it's okay," Tommy said softly, keeping his voice gentle and low. "I'm not going to hurt you or anything." The kid didn't move. It just watched him with those big, fearful eyes. Tommy could see its small chest moving up and down, breathing fast like it was panicked. He realized the kid probably couldn't understand English, or if it could, it was too scared to care. Tommy turned away slowly and pretended to focus on his mopping. He didn't want to scare the kid more. Instead, he worked quietly, keeping his movements smooth and non-threatening. After a few minutes, he walked over to the industrial food disposal and opened the lid. Inside were containers of leftovers from dinner service, pasta with sauce, some pieces of bread, vegetables that had been picked at but were still perfectly good. Stuff that was just going to be thrown away anyway. On impulse, Tommy grabbed a clean container from the supply shelf and started filling it with some of the better-looking leftovers. A good helping of pasta, some bread rolls, even a piece of fruit that was barely bruised. His supervisor wasn't going to miss it. Nobody checked that stuff. It was all heading to waste anyway. Without making a big deal out of it, Tommy placed the container right beside the disposal unit, in a spot where the kid could easily reach it. Then he went back to his mopping, acting like nothing unusual had happened. From the corner of his eye, he saw the small antennae twitch. Slowly, carefully, the kid crept forward. The little one looked at the container, then at Tommy, clearly trying to figure out if this was some kind of trap. After what felt like forever, the kid reached out with one thin arm and pulled the container closer. It didn't open it right away, just held it tight like it was afraid someone might take it away. Tommy felt something twist in his chest. He'd seen poverty before. He'd grown up poor himself. But there was something about seeing a kid this hungry, this scared, this far from home. It got to him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He finished his shift quietly, cleaning up around the kid without making eye contact, just letting them eat in peace. As he left the cafeteria that night, Tommy made a decision. Protocol said he shouldn't be helping aliens, especially not ones from the Zarthon Empire. But protocols were written by people sitting in comfortable offices who'd never seen a hungry kid's eyes. Tommy wasn't going to ignore what he'd seen. The next night, Tommy went back to the cafeteria with a purpose. He brought extra food from his own lunch, a sandwich he'd packed, some fruit he'd bought from the station store with his own money. He felt a little silly doing it, like he was breaking some invisible rule just by caring. But when he saw the empty container from the night before sitting exactly where he'd left it, he knew he'd made the right choice. The kid wasn't there yet. Tommy set up his cleaning supplies and started working, but he kept glancing toward the back corner. Minutes ticked by. He was starting to think maybe the kid wouldn't come back, that maybe it had been a one-time thing, a desperate moment that wouldn't repeat itself. Then he heard the soft sound of feet on metal, quiet, careful footsteps. The Zarthon child appeared from behind a stack of storage crates, moving slowly like it was still deciding whether to trust this strange human. This time though there was less fear in those big eyes. Tommy pretended not to notice. He just kept mopping, humming a little tune under his breath like he was alone, like he didn't care one way or the other. It was a trick he'd learned from his own childhood. Sometimes people and creatures both needed to feel like they were making their own choice to come closer. The kid saw the container Tommy had placed in the same spot. Without any hesitation this time, it rushed over and grabbed it, clutching it to its small chest. Then something interesting happened. Instead of running away to eat and hiding like before, the kid sat down right there on the storage crate just a few feet away from Tommy and started eating. They didn't talk. There wasn't anything to say really. Tommy just kept working, moving around the cafeteria with his mop, and the kid just kept eating, occasionally glancing up at him with those intelligent eyes. Tommy wondered what this little creature's story was. Where had it come from? Why was it alone on a space station? How did a kid end up separated from its people? This became their routine. Every single night for the next 3 weeks, Tommy would come to the cafeteria and the kid would be waiting. Sometimes the wait was longer, sometimes shorter, but the kid always showed up. Tommy started bringing better food. He'd save portions from his meals, pack extra things, even splurged once to buy some fruit that looked especially fresh. The kid's appearance was starting to change. The scales looked less dull. The kid wasn't quite so skeletal anymore. One evening, Tommy noticed something different. When the kid finished eating, instead of just disappearing back into the shadows, it stayed sitting on the crate. The kid looked around like it was thinking hard about something, then reached out one thin arm and started drawing in the dust that had accumulated on the nearby surface. Tommy watched as the kid drew a picture. First came a larger Zarthon figure, clearly an adult, maybe a parent. The kid drew it carefully with more detail than Tommy would have expected. Then the kid drew a smaller figure next to it, that was clearly supposed to be itself. But here's where it got interesting. The kid drew jagged lines between them like lightning bolts or broken glass separating the two figures. Then the kid looked up at Tommy and tapped the small figure, then pointed at itself. Tommy felt something click in his mind. The kid wasn't just hungry and scared. The kid was separated from its family. This little one was lost. Maybe deliberately separated, maybe an accident, but definitely alone in a way that went beyond just being without food. Tommy crouched down slowly so he was at the kid's eye level. He pointed to the smaller figure and then to the kid, asking a silent question. The kid nodded, those antennae drooping down in what looked like sadness. "Where's your family, buddy?" Tommy asked quietly, knowing the kid probably couldn't understand every word but hoping the tone would communicate something. The kid didn't answer in words. It just shook its head slowly, and Tommy saw what looked like moisture gathering in those big eyes. This kid was grieving. This kid was alone on a hostile space station, far from home, probably scared out of its mind most of the time. And Tommy was one of the few beings here who'd shown it any kindness at all. That night, something shifted between them. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was just a quiet understanding that developed in the silence. Tommy wasn't just feeding a hungry creature anymore. He was protecting someone vulnerable. He was being a friend. A few days later, when the kid whispered something in a soft, trembling voice, 3 words spoken so quietly Tommy almost missed them, it sealed the deal completely. "Thank you," the kid said in broken, heavily accented English. "Thank you." Those 3 words hit Tommy harder than he expected. He realized in that moment that protocols and regulations and empire politics didn't matter anymore. This was just a kid. A scared, lonely, hungry kid who needed help. And Tommy was going to make sure that kid got it, no matter what anyone else said about it. Everything fell apart on a Tuesday morning. Tommy was cleaning the maintenance corridor on level B when he got the message on his communication device. It was a work order, urgent, flagged with a red priority indicator. "Report to station commander's office immediately." Tommy's stomach dropped. He'd been working on the station long enough to know that a summons like this was never good news. He made his way up through the corridors trying to figure out what he'd done wrong. Had he broken something? Missed a cleaning area? Violated some safety regulation he didn't even know about? His mind was racing as he approached the commander's office. The door slid open with a hiss and Tommy stepped inside. Station Commander Robert Hayes was sitting behind his desk, and he did not look happy. Next to him stood someone Tommy recognized, Dr. Patricia Okonkwo from the Administrative Division. She had a stern expression on her face, and in her hands were several empty food containers. The containers Tommy had been leaving for the kid. Tommy's heart started pounding. "Sit down, Thompson," Commander Hayes said, his voice cold and formal. Tommy sat, feeling like a kid who'd been sent to the principal's office. Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying Tommy like he was examining an insect under a microscope. "Do you want to tell me what these are?" Tommy thought about lying. For just a second he considered making up some story about why those containers were empty. But he looked at the commander's face and realized it wouldn't matter. They already knew. "I've been leaving food for one of the Zarthon kids," Tommy said quietly. "The little one that's been hanging around the cafeteria. It was hungry." Dr. Okonkwo made a sound like she was choking on her coffee. "You've been what?" she demanded. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand the diplomatic implications of fraternizing with Zarthon civilians?" "It's just a kid," Tommy said, and he could hear the stubbornness in his own voice. "A hungry kid. I wasn't trying to cause any problems. I was just—" "You were just violating direct station protocols," Commander Hayes interrupted. He stood up and walked around his desk so he was standing in front of Tommy, blocking the exit. "The Zarthon Empire is not our friend, Thompson. We maintain a careful diplomatic balance with them. We do not interact with their citizens outside of official channels. We certainly do not provide aid or comfort to—" "It's a child," Tommy said again, more firmly this time. "Not some kind of threat." "That's not your determination to make," Hayes said coldly. "I'm ordering you to stop this immediately. No more food. No more contact. You will stay away from that child completely. Do you understand me?" Tommy wanted to argue. He wanted to tell the commander that he didn't care about protocols, that he wasn't going to let a kid starve just because of some bureaucratic rule. But he could see in Hayes's face that there was no room for negotiation here. So Tommy nodded, even though he had no intention of actually following the order. "Good," Hayes said. "This conversation is over. You're dismissed." Tommy left the office feeling like something inside him had hardened into determination. He was going to keep helping that kid. He didn't care what the commander said. That night, Tommy couldn't sleep. He lay in his small quarters, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the kid waiting in the cafeteria. He wondered if the little one was hungry right now, if it was scared. Tommy decided he'd sneak down there in a couple of hours, after the night shift guard rotations changed. It was risky, but then the alarm started. At first, Tommy thought it was a drill. The alarm system on the station ran tests regularly. But then he heard the second alarm and the third, and they weren't the standard test pattern. These were emergency alarms, the kind that meant something was seriously wrong. Tommy jumped out of bed and rushed to his small viewport. What he saw made his blood go cold. A massive warship was descending through the atmosphere above the station. It was unlike anything Tommy had ever seen. Jet black, shaped like a predator's head, bristling with weapons that looked like they could obliterate the entire station in seconds. And it was moving directly toward them. The weapons array, dozens of cannons and missile pods, was fully extended and glowing with an ominous red light. Tommy's hands were shaking. This was it. This was war. Somehow, his little act of kindness toward the kid had triggered an attack from the Zarthon Empire. The child must have reported back to its people. Maybe it was a spy. Maybe this had all been some kind of trap and Tommy had fallen for it completely. Alarms screamed through every corridor. Emergency lighting flickered red. Over the communication system, a calm but urgent voice repeated, "All personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Tommy threw on his uniform and stumbled out into the chaos of the corridors. People were running everywhere, shouting, pushing past each other to get to safe zones. The station was shaking slightly now, as if the massive warship's presence was putting physical pressure on the entire structure. Then armed guards appeared at the end of the corridor. They grabbed Tommy without a word, rough hands on his arms, and started dragging him in the opposite direction from where everyone else was running. Tommy tried to protest, tried to ask what was happening, but they ignored him completely. They hauled him through the station like he was a prisoner of war. When they reached the command center, Tommy's confusion only grew. Military personnel were everywhere, monitoring screens that showed thousands of armored Zarthon soldiers pouring through the docking bays. And in the middle of all this chaos, someone was pointing at Tommy and saying something into a communication device. Tommy realized with a sinking feeling that somehow this was all his fault. And he had absolutely no idea what was about to happen next. Tommy stood in the command center, surrounded by armed guards, completely bewildered. The massive view screen that dominated one wall showed the Zarthon warship hanging above the station like a dark cloud. Around him, station personnel were tense, hands hovering near their weapons, everyone waiting for something to happen. The air felt thick, like the moment right before a storm breaks. Then the communication system crackled to life. "We are establishing a docking connection," a voice announced in perfect English. It was deep and resonant, with an accent that made every word sound formal and important. Stand ready. Tommy's legs felt weak. This was it. Whatever was about to happen would probably determine whether the station survived the next hour. He wondered if this was what it felt like to be at the end of the world. The docking bay doors hissed open on one of the monitors. Through the view cameras, Tommy watched as a group of figures began moving through the corridors toward the command center. They were tall, imposing, dressed in armor that looked like it was made from some kind of crystalline material that caught the light. These were Zarthon soldiers, elite ones judging by the ceremonial markings on their uniforms. But it was the figure walking between them that made Tommy's breath catch in his throat. It was the kid. His kid. The little Zarthon child he'd been feeding for the past 3 weeks. But this wasn't the scared, hungry creature Tommy knew. This child was walking with its head held high, dressed in robes that shimmered with gold and silver thread. The dull scales that had started to brighten up from better nutrition were now gleaming like polished jewels. The antennae, which used to droop in fear, were held proudly upright. The child walked directly up to Tommy, and the guards tried to pull Tommy back, but the kid raised one arm in a gesture that clearly meant stop. The guards obeyed instantly. The child looked up at Tommy with those same intelligent eyes, but now they were filled with something Tommy couldn't quite identify. Recognition. Gratitude. Maybe even love. This human, the child said in clear, careful English, so much better than the broken whisper Tommy had heard weeks ago, saved my life. When I was alone. When I was afraid. When no one else cared. The child's voice grew stronger. This human showed me what honor truly means. Not strength. Not power. Not fear. But kindness. Mercy. Compassion. Tommy's mind was spinning. What was happening? How was this possible? One of the soldiers stepped forward and placed a communication device in front of Tommy. The screen flickered, and then a face appeared that filled Tommy with a strange mixture of awe and terror. It was massive, far larger than the child, with scales that had deep colors running through them like rivers of crimson and gold. The eyes were ancient and intelligent, holding the weight of centuries of authority. This was clearly someone important. Someone powerful. I am Emperor Velkarthan, the massive figure said, and its voice seemed to vibrate through the entire station. Ruler of the Zarthon Empire. This child you see before you is my youngest heir. My name child. My future. Tommy's mouth went dry. The Emperor continued, 6 months ago, this heir was sent on a diplomatic mission to neutral territory to learn about other species and cultures. The mission was supposed to be a teaching journey, a way to prepare my child for leadership. But during the journey there was an accident. A transport malfunction. My child was separated from their security detail and lost. For 3 months we searched. We used all our technology, all our resources, all our power. And we found nothing. The Emperor paused, and when it spoke again, its voice was different, quieter but somehow more intense. We had begun to accept that my child was gone. Lost forever. The grief consumed our entire empire. We considered it a sign that we should turn inward, away from other species, away from diplomacy. We were preparing to become isolationists, to shut ourselves off from the universe. And perhaps even to respond with violence to any species we deemed a threat. Tommy realized he was holding his breath. But then, the Emperor said, my child was found. Not by our military. Not by our technology. Not through force or power or authority. My child was found by a human janitor. A worker who had nothing to gain. Someone who received no reward, no recognition, no benefit. This human simply saw a child in need and helped. No questions asked. No conditions. No expectations of thanks or payment. The child reached out and took Tommy's hand. Its grip was warm and surprisingly strong. Your people, the Emperor said, addressing Tommy directly now, have shown us something we had forgotten. Something our empire, in all its strength and power, had lost. You have shown us that true strength is not measured in weapons or armies. True strength is measured in the capacity for mercy. True leadership is not about domination. True leadership is about compassion. Tommy could feel tears forming in his eyes, though he didn't fully understand why. Tommy of Earth, the Emperor said, and Tommy almost fell backward at hearing his own name spoken with such formality and respect. You have earned the gratitude of the Zarthon Empire. You have reminded us who we should be. You have saved not just my child's life, but perhaps the soul of our entire civilization. The entire command center had gone completely silent. Even Commander Hayes seemed to be holding his breath. My child tells me you asked for nothing in return for your kindness, the Emperor continued. This is a concept we are still learning to understand. But it is a concept we will carry forward. From this day forward, the Zarthon Empire recognizes humanity not as competitors or potential enemies, but as teachers. As reminders of what true honor means. The child squeezed Tommy's hand tighter. We will leave this station, the Emperor said, and we will remember this lesson. We will carry it through our empire. And we will ensure that no Zarthon child or any child ever goes hungry or uncared for while we have the power to help them. This is our new way. This is what we have learned from you. Tommy looked down at the kid beside him, and for the first time in weeks the child was smiling. The officers in the command center were already preparing offers. Tommy could hear them whispering, positions of honor, wealth beyond imagination, titles that would make him famous across known space. The Emperor was waiting for Tommy's response, and everyone in the room seemed to be holding their breath, wondering what this simple janitor would say. Tommy looked at the child standing beside him, still holding his hand. He thought about all those nights in the cafeteria, the quiet moments, the trust that had slowly built between them. He thought about why he'd done it in the first place, not for reward or recognition but simply because it was the right thing to do. Your Majesty, Tommy said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, I appreciate the honor. I really do. But I can't accept titles or wealth or any of that. He paused, choosing his words carefully. There's only one thing I want to ask. The Emperor leaned forward on the view screen, clearly intrigued. Speak, human. You have earned the right to any request. I want you to promise me that this child will be treated with love, Tommy said simply. Not just as an heir to your throne, not just as royalty, but as a kid. A real kid. With people who care about them as a person, not just as a political figure. That's all I want. That's the only reward I need. For a moment, there was complete silence in the command center. And then something happened that nobody expected. The Emperor laughed. It was a deep, booming sound that seemed to resonate through the communication system and vibrate through the entire station. It was the kind of laugh that came from genuine surprise and genuine delight. A human who refuses reward, the Emperor said, still chuckling. Your species is stranger than we knew. More fascinating than we ever imagined. The laughter faded, replaced by something that sounded like warmth. Your request is already granted, Tommy of Earth. This child will never lack for love or care. I give you my word as Emperor. The child looked up at Tommy with eyes that were shining with emotion. The kid reached up and touched Tommy's face gently, a gesture that somehow communicated everything that couldn't be said in words. Over the next 3 weeks, something extraordinary happened. Diplomats from Station Kepler 7 met with representatives from the Zarthon Empire. Slowly, carefully, they began negotiations. The talks were intense, filled with complicated discussions about trade, territory, and security. But there was something different about these negotiations compared to past attempts. There was actual respect. Actual willingness to listen and understand. The story of Tommy and the child had spread through both civilizations, and somehow it had opened doors that had been locked for decades. The first breakthrough came when the Zarthon Empire agreed to halt its expansion into neutral territories. For years, the Empire had been slowly pushing its borders outward, causing tension with other species and creating fear throughout the galaxy. But now, with a new understanding of what true strength meant, the Emperor ordered the halt. Military vessels were recalled. Aggressive postures were abandoned. Then came the trade agreements. Routes that had been considered too dangerous were opened up. Merchant vessels from Earth and other human worlds began making regular runs to Zarthon space. Resources flowed in both directions. Technologies were shared. Knowledge was exchanged. What had been a cold, tense standoff for years transformed into something that looked like it might actually become friendship. Commander Hayes approached Tommy the day before the Zarthon warship was scheduled to depart. The commander's expression was hard to read, but Tommy thought he saw something that might have been respect in the man's eyes. I owe you an apology, Hayes said quietly. I thought you were violating protocol and endangering the station. I couldn't see past the regulations to what you were actually doing. You showed better judgment than I did, and you probably prevented a war instead of starting one. Tommy didn't know what to say. He just nodded and accepted the apology, though part of him wondered if things might have gone very differently if Hayes had been more understanding from the beginning. The final day arrived too quickly. Tommy stood in the observation deck with the child, looking out at the massive Zarthon warship preparing for departure. The Emperor had granted Tommy permission to say goodbye in private, which Tommy appreciated more than he could express. Thank you, the child said quietly, using those same 3 words that had started this entire incredible chain of events. But this time, the meaning was deeper, richer, loaded with weeks of shared experience and genuine connection. "You're going to be a great emperor," Tommy told the kid. "Better than your father, even. Because you learned something most rulers never understand. You learned that power without compassion is just cruelty with a crown." The child smiled, a real smile full of joy and confidence. The kid reached into a small pouch at its side and pulled out something that made Tommy's heart stop. It was the picture the child had drawn in the dust weeks ago, the one showing the child separated from its family. But now the child had added something else. There was a new figure in the drawing standing next to the small one. And the jagged lines of separation had been replaced with solid lines connecting them. "I wanted you to have this," the child said. "So you remember?" "I will remember too. Always." Tommy took the drawing with hands that were shaking slightly. He pulled the child into an embrace, and the kid wrapped its thin arms around Tommy's neck. For a moment they just held each other, two beings from completely different worlds, separated by biology and culture and species, but connected by something that transcended all of that. When they finally pulled apart, the child walked toward the docking tube. At the threshold, the kid turned back and pressed one small hand against the transparent wall of the observation deck. Tommy stepped forward and placed his own hand against the glass, mirroring the gesture. The warship lifted away slowly, majestically, pulling back from the station with measured precision. Tommy watched it climb through the atmosphere, growing smaller and smaller until it was just a distant point of light against the stars. But even as it disappeared, Tommy kept his hand pressed against the glass. In the weeks and months that followed, things changed. The peace treaty between humanity and the Zarthon Empire held firm and grew stronger. Trade flourished. Cultural exchanges began. Children from both species learned about each other in schools across multiple worlds. Scientists collaborated. Artists shared their work. Musicians performed for audiences of mixed species. And it had all started with one simple act of kindness. One janitor who saw a hungry child and decided that protocols mattered less than compassion. One moment of human decency that had rippled outward and changed the course of galactic history. Tommy kept the drawing on his wall for the rest of his life. Every time he looked at it, he remembered that night in the cafeteria, that small trembling figure in the shadows, and the choice he'd made to help instead of look away. He remembered that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in the universe isn't use force or power or authority. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply show kindness to someone who needs it.